Well, thank you. Good to be here. It's been great to see this program grow, I think, over the more than decade that we've known each other and seen this from its very inception. So it's fun to be invited back and be a part of it. And just to check in, do I sound okay and video's okay for our slideshare and everything? Awesome. I'll dive in and Mar, just to break in. If I've got my chat up as well. Folks have questions, try and respond as we go. But if anything's wrong, just flag me and we'll try and get to it as we go. But anyways, thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to listen and learn a little bit about careers and trust and safety and just the work that we do and the work that can be done by us all to keep the internet safe. I know security is always a thing many of us hear about in the news or we worry about, but it feels very abstract or a thing that's untouchable. But it is a giant career field that has plenty of opportunities for folks with interest to move into. So I thought I'd try to demystify a little bit about, how security works, how you can participate in it, and how it can lead to a, long and fruitful career. One of my favorite jokes is, I don't think I'm going to be put out of business anytime soon. So with that, let me dive into the slides here. As a quick way of introduction, my name is Sai. I'm the head of product at Google for user protections. Essentially, my job is to keep everyone on the internet that we can as safe as possible. Primary threats we worry about are phishing, malware, and fraud. So we have horizontal specialists who focus on those three areas because those are often the things that lead to losing your money, losing your account, losing the data in your account. And in my organization, we have two big parts. The first part is, of course, keeping Google safe. So how do we keep all the products you use from Google, be it Chrome, Gmail, YouTube, Android, whatever it happens to be, safe from these threats, safe for users to use, and create these large underlying technologies that protect against phishing, protect against malware, protect against fraud across all of these different platforms. And on the second half is we sell those same technologies to many of the other companies you probably use who, like social media companies or entertainment companies, streaming companies. They all use a similar set of services that we build for our internal customers externally as actual customers. And so my job at Google is really one, we call it, one mission, two businesses. The one mission is keeping users safe, and we do it through two different ways. One is as an internal technology provider to Google, and then the other one is as an enterprise software business where we sell the same solutions externally. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit of an introduction to some of the ways we do that, just to give you orientation in this space. And you may have seen some of these things. So I picked a couple that one I know you've interacted with, one maybe you haven't. And so, one is safe browsing. And safe browsing is essentially this list that Google has collected and curated of malicious sites, so sites that will do users harm from across the internet. And we look at about 1 billion URLs daily, and we will distribute that list to about 5 billion devices. Now, this, by the way, is far more than just Google devices. This, in fact, is the vast majority of internet-connected devices will consume this list in order to protect themselves from phishing, malware, and fraud. And so, down here you can see this big red warning. This is kind of one of the only times you make the worst UI possible. That's the most discouraging to users to kind of click forward, is in the case where you want to make this warning. Have you seen this? This is largely a product of this product that is watching, known malicious URLs or known scams and stopping you from going there. And you can see from the charts on the right, we look at, and these are, I think, per week, we look at, between 5 and 10 million different warnings that we'll display to users on a very regular basis. And we'll see kind of spikes and troughs of just as different threats come and go. But it's pretty amazing to think about, first of all, just how many threats are out there. And these are just the ones we know about, have confirmed, and saw. And then how many more can be stopped. So this is kind of our large phishing product that you may have interacted with. One way, just from to bring it real, make it very concrete for you all, if you use Chrome, another thing that we launched recently was called Enhanced Safe Browsing. So the Safe Browsing product is kind of everywhere. The Enhanced Safe Browsing product is an additional option where users can say, hey, I'll give you a little bit more data. I'll let you track kind of URLs I'm going to in Chrome. And by doing so, I'll be 20 to 30% safer from phishing and malware. So if anyone using Chrome today, you can just go into your privacy security settings and select enhanced protection versus the standard safe browsing protection to be safer. And it's a pretty cool program in that you can all of a sudden provide an option for those 5 billion devices using your technology to be 20 to 30% safer. And you're doing things like real-time URL checks, download scanning. So if you download anything off the internet, we're able to scan it and make sure it's safe, as well as we call computer vision-based detection. And what that means is we use computer vision in a similar way to the way a human looks at a page and we understand if it's malicious or not. A lot of times, sites will try and trick you into thinking they're your bank, or there's some shopping site you may frequent, by looking similar without any other telltale signs in code. And so what's happening in this technology is the kind of fraudsters are trying to fool you, and they have to get the page looking close enough to something that's bad, something that's good and you trust, that you're fooled, but not so close that our detection can find it. And so it's this constant kind of balancing act between us in our detection and the adversaries in their fraud to kind of create something that's good enough to fool a human, but not so good that it triggers our detection. And so that's kind of a fun thing that we see pretty often. Another technology I'm sure you all have interacted with is reCAPTCHA. This is our basic, account defense technology. It's deployed on 4 million sites. I know many of you, from these pictures are probably used to seeing it in the first two forms, where it's like the squiggly text, or it is, a series of images. And I know those are sometimes frustrating to solve. I'm very happy to kind of share over the past, 4 or 5 years we've been working on this. We've really transitioned to this image over on the right that is the reCAPTCHA v3, or the captcha-less CAPTCHA, as we finally like to call it internally, where we are able to understand if you're an adversary, if you're safe, if you're not, based on the behavior on the page, without forcing you to do a whole separate action. And what this means is users have actually become significantly more secure in more places with 90% less challenges, meaning very, very few of the places you're interacting with, reCAPTCHA on the internet today, you actually will see anything that you might recognize or think of as your traditional CAPTCHA. And so, as we think about ways that, these careers can have impact on the internet and everyone's lives, I mean, this is kind of one kind of small, fun example where hopefully we've made everyone's lives just a little bit easier over this period of time while making them more secure. And the reason I say more secure is kind of a couple-fold. One is observing on-page behavior is a much better indicator of what this entity is than simply solving, these pictures, because what happens is there are paid employees in warehouses around the world that are solving these images for money, and they're probably better than any one of us at it. And so that method doesn't work very well anymore. What works much better is to look at the average user's behavior on a page, what's common, what's not, and then telltale signs for us of what bots and other malicious technologies look like, and try and differentiate based on that. So essentially, with a lot more data, we can make a better decision, which is a very common thing. The second part is, as we remove friction, we can put it in more places. So you can imagine if you had to solve one of these puzzles every single time you accessed any page on a site, you'd get very frustrated very quickly and probably leave. But if you never had to solve one, and in fact, you never even really notice it's there unless you look at the terms of service, we can put it in more places. And that means we can keep users safe when they're viewing a page, when they're logging in with their accounts, when they're checking out and paying, and we do that on web as well as mobile. And so this is kind of one great theme to think about for security or any technology generally, is as you can make it lower friction, so more and more easier to use for users, you can put it in more places, which means you can keep more of the area you're trying to protect safe. Or for any other technology, you can just make it more useful everywhere. We're seeing this with AI today too, right? The easier it is to use, the more places we can put it, and now we'll see AI everywhere. So those are a couple of the products we see. And then other places as examples that you may interact with this technology, but you may not even know it because it's, become frictionless, are, like HBO Max. So, like I have this TV over here. Pretty much every app on that TV will use reCAPTCHA to protect them from account takeovers. Adobe, a whole bunch of software companies will use us, even if you download on your computer. Caribou Coffee, if you go in to get a cup of coffee or you're part of their loyalty program, you'll interact with us every single time. And then Etsy, almost all areas of their site use reCAPTCHA, and you'll interact with them, multiple times as you browse and log in and check out. And it's a great way for us to kind of keep users safe throughout their experience. So those are a couple of examples that kind of illustrate, on one side, how we use reCAPTCHA to keep, Google safe across all of our products, as well as how we use to keep our customers safe, and even in ways that y'all may not know about. So kind of a fun example of ways to help users without them even knowing it. Now, let's kind of talk about the broader security space, beyond kind of what I work on, just to help you think about like, why is it important and kind of where is it in terms of, growth? Because I know that's always important to think about. You always want to be in a growing space. The first is, the Gallup polls, which is this big poll where we ask a bunch of people, what are you worried about? And hacking, identity theft, digital attacks are now the #1 fear, above home break-ins, above car theft, of all the traditional stuff. It really is hacking. And so I think that tells you a little bit about, even in the common thought process, how worried the average person is about this. The cybercrime damage we see overall, and this is reported at a business level, is up to $6 trillion a year globally. So this is a giant amount of damage that's being done. And we only see this as accelerating, because the more things that we put online and put in the cloud, the more exposed those will be. And so we know that things are moving more and more online. And so we know more and more things will be exposed. At the same time, the people learning how to commit these crimes are getting smarter and smarter. Like, they're learning just like we are, where it's a new industry, it's a new way to attack for them. And they are quickly growing into that space. And maybe in the news, you've seen more of this around Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as a very, very new industry with very, very new controls and very, very new attacks. And we're essentially seeing a new class of attack there every year that we've never seen before. With traditional security, you might see that cycle every 3 to 5 years. So it's a little bit more mature. We've kind of figured out a little bit more of the basics, but it's a very similar set of attacks. So I'd expect that number just to accelerate exponentially over time. And then the last trend that you can think about is that we saw, and actually this should be 250 million, I believe. I think I forgot an M there. It's more than 250 accounts compromised in data breaches in 2022. And what that really says is that a lot of your passwords are probably compromised all the time. I would bet with certainty that 90% of you are currently using compromised passwords, which means that you signed up on a page or a website with a password, that page or website got hacked and lost, and then you reuse that password on some other site. And the problem with that is that any adversary now will essentially take your username and password that they know has been compromised, and they will just try it on the top 50 or 100 or 200 most popular sites until they get a hit. And that's called credential scraping. It's a very common form of attack. A good reason, by the way, why you should definitely change your passwords and use password managers, but also why technologies like reCAPTCHA that detect behavior on top of simply the username and password sessions is important and is useful and is becoming more prevalent in the space. Now we think about, so this is quickly, okay, here's the problem. And then now we think about, what are the layers of protection? Like, what does the security industry look like, and how do companies keep us safe? And obviously this varies quite a bit, company to company, industry to industry, but I thought I'd give you kind of the idea of the layers that commonly exist. And, Google, we talk about defense in depth, but it's a pretty common thing across the industry to think about security not as just one single thing that is unbreakable, because we generally do not believe anything is unbreakable or anything is truly secure. We try and just create layers upon layers upon layers, so it becomes very hard to penetrate. And even if one layer fails, you'll have 6 or 7 other layers to go through. And even if you get through some of them, you'll be tracked and alerted along the way. So it's really a game of tracking, awareness, slowing down the attacks versus any absolute, because we really know that the breadth of these platforms, meaning the software we use every day, is so complex, nobody truly understands it. And at the same time, the sophistication of the attackers is constantly evolving, and we can never assume that we fully understand or fully mitigated all attacks. And so when we think about the layers, we think about kind of us, like, me talking on the Zoom call using this, Google Slide share. That is the, first layer we can kind of start our awareness from. Underneath that, you have these tools and services, again, like Zoom or Google Slides, that are providing the core service. So those are the key pieces of software, and they're trying to protect things. And so they're trying to protect things like this conversation. So actually, Zoom is a customer. So by the way, you all are probably using reCAPTCHA right now in order to make sure that we're not Zoom bombed on this call. And that's kind of one example. Underneath that, they have partners, and not Zoom particularly, but generally companies will have partners that help them integrate security solutions, because like many complex things, they may not have the internal expertise to take a security tool and deploy it, or to really optimize it or know what to do. So there's a whole bunch of, we call them professional services companies that exist simply to help another company that has bought a tool properly implement it, monitor it, and make sure that they've kind of configured it in the right way. You can almost think about this maybe as like I don't know, like a car dealership or an auto shop where, you buy a car, you want to drive a car, but you may not know how to change the oil, change the tires, fix a car, diagnose it. And so you're going to hire someone to help you do that for you. Companies are the same way. They don't want to have a specialist in, anti-payment fraud technology. So they might hire someone to help them implement that for them. Those companies or the companies directly will then kind of buy these platforms. And so, these are things like reCAPTCHA, like safe browsing. So the things that I work on every day, we'll either sell directly to these companies or we'll sell to partners to help be implemented for these companies. But these platforms are kind of these core layers of detection that can be assembled to create protection for the end users. And then underneath all of that, there are data providers. So a key ingredient to any good defense, or frankly, any technology online these days, is data. And we're seeing this more and more. In the security space, this really falls into a couple areas. One is general behavior about users on the internet, like who's doing good things, who's doing bad things, who's at risk, who's not. And then the other is categorization of threats. And so, example could be we sell a threat intelligence feed called Web Risk, where we have 1 billion or so known phishing and malware sites that companies can check to see if something they've experienced is malicious. So you can imagine if Bentley installed this, every time you sent an email, they could check every URL to see if it's on this list and then tell you if it is, so you don't access that malicious site. And so really these are the 5 layers that we typically see, and they all really need to come together in a cohesive way in order for companies to be secure. So keep thinking about security as a process of building these layers that work together to slow down, create friction for attacks. Because again, there's no sure solution, there's no perfect cryptography, there's no perfect security. It's all about slowing down the attacks, reducing the probability of attacks, and creating an evolving surface area that adversaries have a hard time understanding and penetrating, versus any one-size-fits-all solution. Now, second, we can go and talk a little bit about the different roles that exist in security underneath those layers. And again, this is kind of a broad generalization, but just to give you a quick overview, we can talk about, all of it work together to make this happen. So, on one side, we can think about like the very technical roles, and the ones probably most, easily associated with the space is security analysts. And these folks come in a couple different flavors. One is certainly the folks that look at the actual security architecture or malware, or really understand the ingredients of the attacks. You can think about these people as the folks that, the bomb squad. They disassemble bombs, they understand how they work, they look at other like very dangerous things, and they understand them very well. On the other side, there's the folks that monitor what's happening in an ecosystem. So they're maybe more like guards, right? So they look at, as we mentioned, there's a series of layers. So as adversaries penetrate or interact with those layers, typically there's alerts and there's data being generated all the time that gives notice that something bad is happening. And there's another set of analysts that will look at these alerts and understand what is happening with the infrastructure and can these attacks be correlated. So an example could be if I'm on a website and I see a spike in users visiting a single page, that might be an event, that might be an attack. And then I see a whole bunch of failed passwords. Well, that starts to look a lot more like an attack than a big event. And so that would be a very simplistic example of what maybe an analyst might look at in order to understand if an attack is happening or not. And you can imagine as they drill deeper, they'll get more and more into what types of attacks can they classify, what reactions do they quickly configure to react to the attacks, and what escalation methods are available to them, what countermeasures are available. You can imagine the password example. The most extreme example could be, well, we're going to shut down all logins because we think something really dangerous is happening. The second could be maybe we implement a more stringent control. So we, configure reCAPTCHA to stop more stuff. And maybe the lightest is we do nothing, or we just monitor it further. And so they're constantly watching the stream of data to understand, what do we do in the case that we see an attack or we see an anomaly, which is a commonly referred to just something strange happening, before we know whether it's an attack or not. The second layer we'll talk about a little bit is engineers. So just like engineers in any other space, they build the platforms that form these layer defenses, and they can build them inside of the security companies. So like at Google, on my tooling, we have a few hundred engineers that are building these technologies, as well as at our customers. So if you think about our customers like Etsy, there's another team over there who we provide our technologies to, and they will assemble them into the layers of protection they use to keep their site safe. And so really the engineers happen at both layers, and there's a broad range of specialization that can exist, all the way from data engineers who are very good at assembling and modeling and shipping data, to people who are very good at security specific concerns like detection of malware and the machine learning involved in that. By the way, I should mention, almost all of our defenses and detections are machine learning and AI generated. The general way the threats and detection work in the space is that when you observe a significant portion of internet traffic, you're able to monitor what looks good and what looks bad and start to draw associations between those. This is far greater data and velocity of change I think any human could possibly keep up with, because there are quite literally tens of millions or maybe even hundreds of millions of adversaries, meaning hackers and fraudsters who are working every single day to create new and creative ways to trick us. And we found that any human or any single human is probably too slow to keep up. And so we rely on AI that is supported by these teams of engineers, security analysts, PMs, and the other people kind of mentioned in this chart. And the last, and this is kind of where I come in, is the product management or program management, sometimes as it's called, in these companies. Typically, you find them more in technology-oriented companies, but they'll often be everywhere. And the role here varies probably more than any of the roles in the sheet, where they can mean a very different thing in different places. So if we think about what I do at Google, it really is to understand a market opportunity, set a strategy, and then execute against it to build a business. And so an example could be actually reCAPTCHA, where when I started to work on a reCAPTCHA, it was a 4-person research team, believe it or not. So very, very tiny team that was very good at creating friction that stopped fraudulent account signups. So it was because everyone had to solve these CAPTCHAs, you could only put it in a place where there's naturally going to be user interaction in the first place. And that typically was at the sign up or filling out a form or submitting something. That was a common place to see these things. And I said, hey, there's actually this big opportunity in account takeover. So we mentioned the slides a few slides back. There's all these passwords that are leaked out there on the internet that are compromised. So actually people need, every time they log in, something other than a password to check if this is malicious or not. Is this a credential stuffing attack, or is this a legitimate user trying to input their real password? And so really, as a PM, my job was to put those two things together and say, hey, we can take this technology, we can build a bigger team around it, and then we can make that into an enterprise business we sell to other places, again, like our customers at HBO and Etsy and Caribou Coffee, that will make their users safer. And that as Google, we can build it as part of our cloud business around it. In the last 4 years, I don't know this for sure, but I haven't seen anything that's faster growing. I think we're one of the fastest growing products in the cloud. And so it's really my job as a product leader to kind of think about what the users need, what the users are interested in, what are the gaps in the space, and what assets we have as a business or could build, and then putting all those things together. And I would say a lot of your time, a disproportionate amount of your time, is probably in the putting those things together part, where I think the basic plan for reCAPTCHA and the basic architecture for what we're going to build and the customer segment we're going to go after was really done in 3 months. And I've probably spent 4 years taking that plan from an idea on a few pieces of paper to reality. And so as you think about this role, frankly, the one thing it has in common is it's always going to be very execution oriented, where I think people sometimes think like, oh, PM role is all about strategy. And strategy is very important, because with the wrong strategy, the execution doesn't matter. But even with the right strategy and execution, that right strategy doesn't matter. So those two things need to fit hand in hand, and you'll always spend more time on the execution end of it. And that can mean really anything from, ensuring the engineering timeline is on track, to making sure customer deployments are done properly, to making sure our sales team is trained properly and is operating efficiently. So really, it becomes, everyone's job becomes your job. And that's kind of both the joy and pain of being a product leader, because you are at the end often responsible for the success and failure of a product line. Everyone else's jobs becomes yours. And I personally really enjoy that, but also it's a good way to figure out if this is the role for you. You find yourself worrying about everything required to deliver successfully. This could be the job for you. If you want no part of it and you want to be hyper focused on one element of it and not be worried with what everyone else is working on, that could be a good path for an engineer or security analyst, or one of these other roles we'll get to on the right-hand side of the page. And so one of the emerging fields we see is called trust and safety. And trust and safety may actually include PMs and engineers, but it may also be different. And again, just like PMs, every different org treats them a bit differently. But what they share in common is, because users are worried about trust, because users are worried about security, there needs to be a whole set of new roles here that help users feel better, and not just feel better, but actually make them safer. And so within Google, the primary difference between these folks and what I and my engineering team do, obviously we're very close partners, is they will look at the functioning of our technologies in order to assess how well they're working. And so we kind of treat them as the arbiters of our success or failure, where they really kind of represent the users and the success, and if our technologies are being effective. And if they're not, they'll do things like they'll do a lot of configuration on our end, or they'll tell us like, hey, here's what we need to adjust the machine learning to be a better fit for this new type of threat. And oftentimes we have people who are very similar to security analysts who sit in this team, and they may be a mixture of like the data science and the analyst role. They'll look at, for example, a set of maybe attacks that got through, and they'll understand, okay, what is the nature of this attack from purely our telemetry standpoint? And then they'll go in and try and find a specific threat or specific piece of malware they can disassemble. And so they're this great group that is at the end of the day responsible for making the user safer. But like PMs, they take on a whole bunch of different roles in order to make that happen. A couple of the roles underneath them that may, by the way, be included in the PM role or the trust and safety role. So you can see there's a very fuzzy boundary of all these roles are policy, where policy is a very important consideration, not only for security, because there's always a balance of how easy is this thing to use, how accessible is this thing to use for everyone versus how secure is it, as well as in the platform level, like how do we think about collecting data? The example I showed you of enhanced safe browsing, it's a great evolution in security where we're making users 20 to 30% safer. But in order to do so, we need to see more of the user's data. And we spend a lot of time thinking about, from a policy perspective, how do we do this in a GDPR compliant way? How do we do it in a very transparent way? How do we do it to give users the maximum choice? And the example I gave of enhanced safe browsing is a particularly interesting example, because the conclusion we came to is that we actually want to ask for data that is quite a bit more extensive than what typically is asked for. And in order to do so, we need to ask for what's called explicit consent. So you say, hey, we need to actually, and you'll see that if you go and click on your preferences, is like, we explain to you exactly what we're asking for, and you can grant or deny access for that specific set of data only for that specific set of security usage. And so that was really guided by our policy understanding of what international regulations are, of what consumer sentiments are, what consumers will understand and appreciate or not, as well as what we need to actually perform the security service. And so policy really sits in that middle ground. And from a security and privacy standpoint, that policy world is only becoming increasingly complex. And I think that's actually, by the way, generally a positive thing. It's becoming more complex because users and governments are becoming more aware of the importance and power this data plays in their lives. And so I'm really glad people are more aware. It definitely takes more work for us to explain and be transparent and really engage with our users and engage with our stakeholders, thought partners. But I'm really happy that they're excited to engage too. And this is a conversation that I think will lead the industry as a whole towards a better shared understanding of what's the best optimization between privacy, security, usability that we can have over time. And then the last, but certainly not least role I'll talk about is data science. And the data scientists are really those specialists who look at large amounts of data to understand what's going on. And for all areas of technology, and particularly artificial intelligence driven technology, this area is very important, because when you think about building artificial intelligence, it's not really like building any other kind of software where you actually are more or less telling the computer what to do. In this case, what you're really doing is you're feeding the computer a bunch of data, and then you're watching its outputs, and then you're tuning that based on what you tell the computer to think of the data and what data you feed it. And really, these data scientists are at the heart of that. So we kind of think about, a lot of times, not us as building AI, but almost like gardening AI or curating AI. And really, these data scientists are at the heart of that. And so as a whole, these are 6 of the ways you can kind of think about engaging in the space. And maybe at a high level, I can take an attempt at thinking about proclivities or things you enjoy and how they make map to these spaces. So security analysts tend to be like much more interrupt driven people. So they really like it when, something changes, they can react to it. So they're kind of maybe the emergency room doctors of our profession. And so you kind of enjoy a little bit of adrenaline. This is often where these people excel. Engineers, I'd say, are very similar to other SWEs in other areas. Maybe the engineers we have in security have a much more technical proclivity, because oftentimes the platforms you build are not even built for users. They're actually built to defend against other adversaries. So if you like, playing chess, or you like kind of thinking about game theory, a lot of what these engineers spend their time thinking about is that. And same, by the way, for the PMs, where it's a very technical role. It's very game theory oriented. We spend a bunch of time thinking about, what are the adversaries going to do? What are the risk levels? What are the different doors we can close and windows we can nail shut in order to prevent this while keeping users flow easy? For trust and safety, they tend to be very broad thinkers. As I mentioned, like PMs, there's a bunch of different roles they have, and there's a very broad mandate to keep users safe. So oftentimes they have to have the largest vision and really think across a whole bunch of these different roles to really negotiate between the business and security teams what the right layers of protection are and how they can be implemented. For policy, obviously, like any folks who are legally minded or politically minded are great fits here, because I think there's a lot of thought that goes into it and a keen understanding of the letter of the law, of the precedents, as well as the policy as it evolves. And by the way, it evolves almost quarter by quarter. I think every 3 to 4 months, there's a significant policy change that we need to understand, think about, and potentially react to. And then lastly, the data scientists, like obviously great folks who are good at math, interested in like cellular automata and state theory. Like these are great ways for folks to play in the data science world. And by the way, in the data science world, it's also really exciting, because there has never been a time where there's been more open source data available to everyone in order to play and understand and really become a great data scientist on their own. And there's a bunch of examples of kind of amateur data scientists getting out there and having a huge impact just by kind of playing around in their free time with public data sets, be they, blockchain, security data sets, or another fun was there's the public data set from the Enron fraud case. All emails from that company are now public record, and you can find them on a Carnegie Mellon site. So there's infinite amounts of fascinating data to play with. So there's never been a time where it's easier for y'all to pick up these tools and really get familiar with them on your own. I'll say a quick word about kind of career outlook. I mentioned, hey, this is a big and growing space, but maybe I'll put some numbers to it. The first stat is from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So they have kind of a narrow definition, which is not inclusive of the whole security space, but just for US information security analysts. And those are kind of the security analysts. That's like the top left box I showed in the prior slide. Median pay is 100K, so not too shabby there. There's 163,000 jobs, and it's growing 30% year over year, which means that we'll create 56 million new jobs over the next 10 years. And this is only in the US and only for this one very narrow role in that space. So just give you a sense of how quickly this is growing. And honestly, my expectation is this would accelerate. The other thing we observe is that, no schools are putting out 35% more people. There's no training program that's going to provide 35% more professionals in the space. So this is a career path that is continually underemployed, meaning like we cannot find enough people who are specialized in this space. And so companies do kind of everything under the sun to attract, retain, train people in this area. So very good job security, very great growth opportunities. And basically until hackers stop hacking stuff, I think you always have a good job and good growth opportunity. That will only really plateau once the digital kind of transformation into the cloud is complete. And I see that's 10 or 15 years out. So I expect this to continue for maybe even 10 or 20 years of continual rapid growth in these careers, well beyond what any new set of employees can provide. So great job security, great growth opportunities. The second stat below here, to give you a sense, is about 3.5 million unfilled jobs globally, and this is across all areas, and this is up from about 1 million 10 years ago. And so this kind of supports the prior statement I made in that this is a big space that is growing rapidly, and there's not enough people to fill the jobs, and that problem is only getting worse over time, which, by the way, generally means just salaries will keep going up as people fight to retain the limited set of talent they have, which, by the way, is good for people working this space. So just a quick word on career outlook if you're considering it. By the way, this is very apropos because yesterday was Safer Internet Day. I don't know if you know that exists. It's a special holiday for us in the security space. So I thought it'd be remiss if I did not at least share maybe 6 really quick tips that I think are all very manageable that will make you immensely safer online. And the first I mentioned is, use a password manager with unique passwords. Again, Chrome is one that I use a lot. Obviously, there's some bias there because I'm at Google, but I really do like the tool. The other cool thing that we did with Chrome is we'll be able to show you all the different passwords that we're aware that are compromised that you're using. So we look out at these public or semi-public databases of compromised passwords, and we'll say, hey, we see your username and password here that you're using on this site in Chrome. Please change it. It's going to be much better for you. So there's some cool things you can see there. 2 is, please sign up for 2-factor authentication, meaning when you log in, it sends you a little text message on your phone or requires you to use a hardware key. And I'll actually pull this out. If people haven't seen a hardware key before, here's a little Google branded one, so you can see kind of what it looks like. And all it really is a piece of hardware that says, hey, I know that I'm associated with Sai, and I know when Sai touches the sides of me that I'm present at the computer. And so basically, if someone wanted to steal my password, they wouldn't be able to use it without this thing. So they have to steal my password and steal this thing from me physically before they could attack my accounts at Google, which is very, very useful, very hard to do. Third is keep software up to date. This includes your laptop as well as routers or any other technology, because people will use old software that has known attacks to break in. And what happens is when an attack is not known but exists, it's called a 0 day. So we kind of count it in days. And then when it first comes out, the most advanced hackers will know about it and use it. So it's a small number that use it for very targeted things like attacking governments. And then once it's been around for a while, so let's say there's an attack that's 5 or 6 years old, everybody on the internet knows about it. There's probably prepackaged programs you can buy for a low price to help you execute these attacks. At that point, you become very, very insecure. So if you have not updated something in at least a year, there's probably a whole bunch of attacks that are known to the world that the manufacturer of the software has actually solved. But if you haven't upgraded, you're not taking advantage of that. And so you're just vulnerable to anyone who pays the small fee to get the hack and use it against you. 4 is, and this is one that's actually becoming, this is probably one of the biggest emerging areas I see, is only give data in outbound calls. So this is a terrible practice I see that many companies will use, is like the bank will call you and ask you for something. For example, there's detected fraud on your card. The bank, and I've had my bank call me and ask me for personal details related to that account from a number I don't know. That is bad. And even in the case of their legitimate calls, you should never do that. What you should do is say, oh, well, let's say I use Bank of America. Bank of America called me. Great. I'll take that information. I will then call the public Bank of America number that is listed and known and trusted in order to establish that. And that's the only way for you to really be sure that you're talking to the right person. Otherwise, anyone can spoof any number of phone numbers or pretend to be whoever they want. And if you give them information, they can cobble that together to create different kinds of attacks or take over your account. So again, it's a practice that many companies do not follow, much to my chagrin. But as a consumer and as an individual, what you can do is just never give that information out over the phone. Never give anything that's not like publicly findable on the internet out to someone who calls you. And frankly, I rarely even take those calls. So there's that. 5, backup data regularly. Probably all lost to paper or something due to like not backing stuff up. It's useful. It's easier than ever now with the cloud. So it's just a kind of a no-brainer. And then the last, it's kind of becoming a newer thing, but also very important, is use a VPN. And it's a virtual private network. Essentially what this is a way for you to encrypt all of the communications happening over the internet. So the only people that can see them are you and the site you're transmitting it to. And the reason that's becoming more and more important is because there's so many different hops between you and whoever you're sending data. So for example, I'm giving a talk to your professor in the room. Well, it's going from my computer to my router to my, local internet provider, which is AT&T. It's going through all these different backbones throughout the internet to somewhere in, Bentley's university routing system, all the way to your professor's computer, right? There's probably like 40 to 50 different hops, and every single one of those hops can see your data, or anyone in the room who's got a good packet sniffer can even sense and detect that data. If it's unencrypted, anything you type could be observed. So you really want to ensure that everything is encrypted, primarily encrypted end to end. So encrypted such that, me and your professor are the only two people with the keys, and anyone in the middle just sees encrypted garbage that they have really hard time to decode. And so that's why I highly encourage y'all to think about using VPNs, particularly if you're accessing any public Wi-Fi system. So Bentley, I'm sure, has good security and pretty good, well-monitored Wi-Fi. If you go to your local coffee shop that has just installed like a normal router and hasn't updated it, there could be a bunch of people watching that router, watching for unsecured computers in order to take credentials off of this and detect things. This is very common in highly populated districts where there's going to be a bunch of different people connecting to Wi-Fi with their phones, with their computers, that can be attacked, and then get credit card numbers or passwords or accounts through that information. So please consider that, particularly if you are out in public and using shared public Wi-Fi systems. Also note, when you connect to those Wi-Fi routers, you don't know if those are compromised or if they're malicious or not. So really be careful connecting your computer to any internet system you don't trust. And by the way, I'll add that also includes plugging in your phone to any USB port. Even if it says it's just a charging port, it can access data and introduce exploits through that USB. So really try and avoid, plugging your device into anything that is unknown. Now, ways to get involved. So any of this sounded interesting to you, or sounded like, raised some points of curiosity? I'll start with kind of a fun one. I love Darknet Diaries. If you're a podcast fan, it's one of the things I love to listen to, and it's just like fun stories about different attacks and hacks, and just kind of gets you familiar with the space in a fun narrative way. I'll write a lot about this, as well as different career things and different types of content on my LinkedIn. So you can go to linkedin.com/n/CYKHO. And then Google writes, of course, a lot about security exploits we find, different things we're doing to secure you, at security.googleblog.com. And so that's just the consumption side. So I know your students are all busy, but as you think about engaging, it's good to start consuming, start like seeing this more and more and getting a feeling for what's going on there. And then as you get more curious and maybe more engaged, you can start to create. And I think that really starts with, securing yourself. Like, have you done the basics to make yourself secure? And that's, the VPN, the password manager, making sure all your software is upgraded. 2 is go check out questions on Stack Overflow, GitHub, open source projects. Oftentimes there's things where like a little bit of internet research can help you answer someone else's question, and you learn along the way. And it's a great way for you to provide value without like having to go really deep in this space. And then if you want to go even further, you can start to test and do bug reporting on software, or even participate in public bug bounties. Oftentimes companies will actually provide money. So they'll provide a bounty to people who report to them legitimate attacks. So if you find something, for example, in Google software that is not secure, and you report it to us responsibly, as in don't share it with the internet, just tell us so we can go fix it, we will pay you cash money. And many other companies will do that. It's a way for us to extend our security team. We pay researchers who are doing good work to make sure our software stays more mature, and we can actually find all these potential vulnerabilities before someone malicious does. And so those are the quick ways to get involved. But that was the quick end of my talk. So let me take a deep breath and open it up for questions, and happy to spend the next 30 odd minutes or however long we have to dig into these areas, talk about product management, talk about Google, or just anything else you all are curious about.
Sai, that was awesome. Thank you. If you guys on the screen could turn on your cameras and say hello, we can take some questions. So feel free to unmute and turn on your cameras, turn on your mics, and say something so we know you're really there. Otherwise, we'll ask questions of you.
Just calling random people.
Okay, we're gonna start calling on random people. Reese, go ahead. Tell us something you learned from Sai's talk, or something you found interesting.
Well, I just found interesting the number of jobs that are like, I didn't even think how many jobs could be in internet security.
Yeah.
Could you imagine yourself doing any of those jobs?
I definitely need to get more techie in order to do that, but it is very interesting.
That's why you're in CS 100. Cool.
Yeah.
Aiden, say hello to us. Thank you.
Hello.
Hey, Aiden, tell us something today.
All right. So I actually had a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I know you're talking about the reCAPTCHA and how there's the different forms.
Mhm.
I know on a bunch of websites, I've seen the click here if you are not a robot box.
Mhm.
How does that work?
Yeah, so it works very similarly to kind of the way the kind of no captcha version works. So that was almost a precursor to that. And so if you think about it, all that's doing is it's forcing a single action on a page. So when you're on the page, it's doing all the mouse tracking movements, it's looking at your user agent, it's looking at all the interaction that leads up to you clicking that box. And then it's using the data up to that point to assess whether you're a robot or not, or whether you're potentially a malicious actor or not. Again, like all the other captchas, we found those to be going away because I don't want to just observe you at one point in time. I actually want to observe the behavior over a long period of time and really only provide the assessment when there's a critical action. And so there's an action where a bot or a malicious user would actually want that to happen. And so for us, it often is when you click enter on a password submission or when you click buy, like those are all these critical events that actually are meaningfully different and could create harm. And so what'll happen is we'll actually now collect data all the way up until that point. And then when you click buy, we'll provide a assessment to our customer, who's the company you're using, to assess whether that's a legitimate or illegitimate action. And so you can think of like the click to prove you're not a robot as like the very early prototype of that end solution that's more deployed today. It's a great question, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, one other thought, Reese, I was thinking about kind of thought of becoming techie or non-techie. Depending on your interest, another thing to think about is a lot of these attacks are really thinking about humans, the way humans interact. One of my favorite events, there's a conference called DEF CON. It's a bunch of hackers get together. Is they'll actually extract information or they kind of commit a hack against a company from a phone booth with a paper and a pencil. And so purely through conversation and a phone call, they're able to get highly sensitive information through social engineering out of it. And so when you think about these systems, even if your interest is purely like humanities oriented, a lot of this is psychological. A lot of this is just how people operate and interact and thinking deeply about that game theory versus like the actual technologies of encryption and other things. So there's a kind of a broad range of ways you can participate in this space depending on your interests.
Adi, question for you or a comment from you?
I don't really have a question, but I just found it really interesting how that like some of the statistics, like with 74% of Americans finding that like hackers are the most like something that installs a lot of fear in people. I found that to be interesting.
Yeah, I always love that stat too. Actually, didn't before I saw it, I didn't think people were as aware of it as they are, but I'm kind of glad they are because I do think it's probably one of the most likely attacks. And by the other reason it's very likely is that most of the attacks can be perpetrated from outside the United States. And so if someone attacks you and they get caught, there's pretty much no consequence for most of the attackers. And so it's truly like an internet scaled attack where if I break into someone's house, it's like, okay, I got to break in there. There's a lot of risk to me. I can only do it one at a time. Like it's very non-scalable, right? Whereas hacking is very scalable because I can essentially attack anyone in the world with very few consequences whenever I want. I can do it like millions of computers at a time. And so the rate of attack is just kind of exponentially higher than you'd ever see in a regular like day-to-day, theft or car break-in or things like that.
Lauren. Nate Sai.
Yeah, I was wondering, you keep talking a lot about computers and how this is like hacking computers, but what about phones? Like, is there a difference between like hacking the two? Is there a way to protect your phone as you would a computer, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I probably use the term computer just too broad. I kind of think of phones as computers, but there are some differences. And I think you're right. You should absolutely think about protecting your phone in the exact same ways you protect computers. And there's a couple of differences from a consumer standpoint that we observe. Maybe three. One is good in that the phones are a little more controlled than your computers. So iOS and Android have a bunch of built-in security. and constraints that normal computers don't have. So you can only install certain apps. The apps installed come through the App Store. They're all kind of managed by the same app manager. There's a lot of good controls there because it's a little bit of a simpler device in that way. What are some of the bigger risks? The biggest one, ironically, is that it's just a smaller screen and people tend to be less aware. So we think about, if we see phishing attacks, they're much more commonly successful on mobile devices than computers, and they're for a couple of reasons. One is visual fidelity. So if you look at a login page, you're just on a smaller screen, you're probably not looking as closely, and so more people are fooled. The second is they don't check the URL. So if you go to a site and says, googlelogin.io, and that's like the login page for a Google site, it's probably not. That wrong URL is probably a good signal. But I don't know about you, but I pretty much don't read any URLs on my phone, or I rarely do. And so it's an easier form of attack. So what are some things that you can do that will keep yourself safer? I'd say actually the biggest one is really continue using two-factor authentication on all your devices. Like that's really powerful because let's say you lose your phone or someone hacks your phone, to get access to anything else, someone need to hack all of your devices at once, which is significantly harder than just hacking or losing one of your devices. So that's kind of one thing you do. The second thing is use a fairly complex password and have the ability on your device to delete all data. Because the most common thing about your phone is you'll lose your phone, right? Like it's pretty common, happens all the time. You want to be able to, one, make sure people can't just get in with no password, which is, by the way, very common, or an easy password they can guess. And then two is the minute it's connected to the internet, you should get a signal that deletes all your data. Because the device is one thing, but losing all your data is a much, much worse area. You think about kind of like a wallet, where like if you lost your wallet with $50 in it, that's bad, but it's way worse that you lost your ID and your credit card and all the things you have to recover. So imagine you could just immediately make all those disappear. So those are a couple of things to think about that'll make you a little bit safer on your mobile device compared to your computer, but do think about them as very similar devices that will converge over time. So as phones get more powerful, they're just becoming computers, and computers are becoming like phones. So they're a little bit different in those ways, but say in 10 years, they'll be the same thing. It's a great question, but it's like something I love to think about. And we think about a lot actually at Google, because they are like subtly distinct. And the rate of growth of mobile phones is accelerating much, much faster than computers, particularly, by the way, in the rest of the world. And much of the world, you look at India and China, many people have mobile phones and very few people have computers, relatively speaking. So it's kind of an interesting new frontier for us.
Thank you. That was so interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Elliot, how about you? Elliot. Back to Elliot. Wes.
Yeah, I just found it really interesting how like reCAPTCHA is used on like multiple different services, like how it's used across like HBO Max and Etsy. Could you talk more about that?
Sorry, talk more about how it's used?
Yeah, like how it's used in the background.
Yeah, so the most common use, and for those in particular, is called account takeover defense. Or as I mentioned, like the most common attack we've seen is that someone will steal a bunch of passwords and then reuse them across a bunch of different sites. And this is essentially used on the login pages of all of those sites to stop that from happening. So as we mentioned, kind of it observes behavior. So what happens is when you go onto, the HBO site, reCAPTCHA will start observing your behavior and evaluating, like, okay, what are you doing? Does it look malicious or does it not look malicious? And then you click login, lets you type in your username and password, and it's correct. That will be evaluated with reCAPTCHA's assessment of whether you're an adversary or not. So let's say an adversary stole your password and is using it versus you legitimately using your password. We'll be able to kind of tell the difference and then make a recommendation based on that. So that's kind of how it's used. And then for other sites, it's being expanded. So that's the core use case, by the way. So this is a thing where, I think when I started, it was kind of a new threat, a new type of attack. We mentioned these attacks happen every 5 years. This had really started to ramp at the beginning of my kind of time with working on reCAPTCHA. And I think it's a technology now that is spread across all companies essentially in the space. And so we've seen this really rapid deployment of it. And now it's extending to scraping, which is a practice of kind of illegally collecting data off of websites. And this is very common in, between e-commerce competitors. You can imagine like Amazon and like, another company, or like trying to find who charges least for toothpaste, right? They'll have bots trying to scrape each other pages, or there's a particularly good content site online that has like great, cliff notes. a company could go through and try and scrape all those notes to create their own repository that, of course, the Cliff Notes doesn't want them to do. And so we can defend against that. And then we can also defend against what's called payment fraud. And so that's where someone steals your credit card and then tries to use it to buy something on, say, Etsy, and then ship it to their house, right? If that happens, you'll report it as fraud, which means that Etsy doesn't get paid and the adversary gets to walk away with a free, whatever they bought. And so those are a couple of the ways we're seeing it expand over time. And it's been really fun to see kind of this little area that started as, stopping fake account creation expand to, kind of protecting across all devices. So we've got like special, Lauren's question, special iOS and Android versions in addition to our web versions. And then protecting against all kinds of fraud, all the way from the first page view to your login to your checkout.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Nicola, you're up next.
Who's your professor?
Hello. Do you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay. So what I found interesting about the growing threat, over 250 million accounts have been compromised in 2022. Would you say that maybe in the next 10 years we would see this number increase, decrease, and what is Google going to do about if, say, it increased?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we see it accelerating. Like I only see this number going up. I'll share, I think it's gone up by about 10x in the last like 4 or 5 years. And the reason is people realize how valuable it is, because once I steal, let's say I go to, I can't remember who the last, I won't name the last data breach, but there's these data breaches happen almost on a monthly basis. And let's say I get, every student at Bentley's username and password, then I can resell that for a lot of money to other people who just try it on a bunch of different sites to see where they get in. And then they get access to credit cards, account information. Like it's kind of a whole economy that happens. And so this will definitely happen. Now, what are we doing about it? There's a few layers that we're trying to attack this problem on. I think the first layer is our own SSO technology, right? So when you say click login with Google or log in with Facebook, log in with whatever provider you want to use, those are great because you're using one authentication to kind of prove your identity across a bunch of others. You're not trying to do it with passwords. You're using something much, much more secure. That's one. If you can't use that, because I know not everyone has the same SSO provider, we have a password manager. So you can have unique passwords that are automatically generated and stored across whatever sites you want to use. And again, use any password manager you want. They're all pretty good. The third thing is we will spot passwords because people often are reticent to use the auto-generated passwords because they're complicated to remember. And they'll use passwords that are easy to remember. We will tell them if those passwords have been compromised. So that's kind of all the things we're doing on the user side. And then we flip to the enterprise side, so kind of side I work on as well, where it's like, okay, gee, if this is like the reason reCAPTCHA I think has had a large deployment is the presumption of a reCAPTCHA customer is that they cannot trust passwords anymore. And I believe that. I think passwords right now might be a 70% chance that it's actually the legitimate user and maybe 30% chance it's fraud. And so it's no longer, this 99.999% thing. It's really going to require something different with it. And so we use reCAPTCHA to further verify that. And then we have on top of that, we call it Account Defender, but we have essentially like a hijacking monitoring technology that after you've logged in, will continue to monitor your behavior in and out of sessions to understand if you are doing something unusual. So let's say you fooled us at the front gate, we'll watch you the whole rest of the time you're interacting with the software to see if we think this is like a deviation of behavior we expect. And then actually a couple of other cool things I forgot to say on the phishing side is we of course have safe browsing. So there's 2 ways passwords are lost. One is you got fooled by something online or social engineering, you give it to someone, right? This is kind of like the phone booth example. The other is a company lost it for you. And so in the case where you lost it yourself, we first of all try very hard to prevent that by sharing out that block list and making sure that those sites are flagged. You see the big red warning. The second cool thing is if we see like you're on enhanced safe browsing and we see that you visited a site that we know to be malicious, even after we figured out it was malicious, we can send you a warning and ask you to update your password. And the third is we can observe all the times that you have entered your password into malicious sites and start to track and correlate all the data as it moves through our systems. And actually, that's a great gift for us as a security team at Google. We can watch, let's say someone runs a malicious ad and gets to install something bad from the Chrome Web Store, and the Chrome Web Store thing, turns into malware on Chrome, and then it gets your password. Like we can see that entire process and stop it. at any layer or at all the layers. And so I talked about at the very beginning of the talk, like, hey, we really focus here on defense in depth, layers of defense. And this is just, by the way, a sampling I told you, but we kind of named already like 8 or 9 layers of protection that are there, where if an adversary were to attack you, even if you're not a Google user, even a customer of our services, they're going to have to go through like 50 or 60 layers to kind of get at you. And chances are better than not, they'll get trapped somewhere along the way. So it's a great question, but we 100%, I say this, I'll speak for myself. I 100% believe that more and more of these passwords are going to be compromised. And so we're introducing more and more of these layers. And then the last thing that we might think about down the road is as passwords become less and less trustworthy, they just become annoying. And so there is a very real chance of a passwordless future. And you can think about this as like, maybe it's your like fantasy sports site or news site or some account that just doesn't have to be that secure. We can just have you log in and use your, fingerprint, or use like the way you interact, or use a cookie, or use an SSO in order to give you access to that account. And you never even need a password in the first place. And so that I think is kind of where the future is going, is finding really a future beyond passwords, because I think just like the puzzle pieces of reCAPTCHA, passwords utility is falling and the friction is constant, which is never good, where you're essentially having the same level of annoyance for a less and less useful thing. And so I think the future is really in thinking about how do we create, for scenarios that don't need it, a zero friction environment, and scenarios that do need it, something that's very high security, as in using, using these security keys, using 2FA. Another cool thing we have, by the way, coming out is you can use your Android phone as a hardware second factor. So rather than having this specific piece of hardware that proves that you're there with the device, you can use your Android phone to do the same, and it has the chips built into the phone itself in the new Pixels. So there's a whole bunch of things we're doing, and it probably tells you also, again, I don't speak for Google in this, but the fact that we're building all these things might indicate that we believe the future to have more of these things at risk.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, my pleasure.
2 things before we go to iPhone, who I don't know who that is. For those of you who are still on the call, there's a QR code on the screen. Please scan that and fill out the report on there, the survey on there, the questionnaire about this session, so we have your responses, and do that before you go. And let's go to iPhone, whoever that is, and see if you have a question for us. Oh, and then before we do that, Elliot had a question that didn't come through. It was on chat. He asked about benefits of ethical hacking. He said, is it hard to do and hard to learn? And are there any benefits of it?
Yeah. Oh, so we'll start there. We'll see if Ivan has a question. Elliot, great question. And absolutely, like, there's tons of ethical hacking. We work with them all the time. As I mentioned, it's one of those things that, it's actually a great way to get involved in the space, is that, you can start to work on these things called bug bounties. So again, almost all companies that I know about will literally have a public page and say something effective. If you find something wrong with our software that is a security issue, and you report it to us kind of privately, and you give us, some period of months to fix it, which is kind of what we call responsible disclosure, we will pay you money. And in Google's case, it can be like, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's very common across these companies to actually incentivize this. Also, we have academics that do it all the time. So I work with many academics in the security space who are constantly trying to find ways to attack our software. And that's actually a great gift for us, because it makes our software stronger. Like, we know if they could have hacked it, someone else could have also hacked it. I'd much rather a responsible person hacks it, disclose it to me, helps me fix the issue, rather than a adversary who will use that to steal a bunch of user data or do something bad to users, and they're not going to report it. So that might take a year for us to realize and cause a bunch of damage. Whereas if a responsible entity finds it, it purely makes our software better. And so it's a great thing to do, highly encouraged, a great way to get involved. And you can even start, before even thinking about hacking, think about just bug reporting. Like, there's a lot of times where software doesn't work as it should, or there's something wrong with the software and you just want to report it. That's very helpful. And I would say it's not too difficult to learn how to use. Just be very, very careful. You read the terms on these bug bounties. And I would say I would not recommend going like randomly trying to attack different pieces of software, because the laws and regulation around that will vary wildly. You don't want to get yourself in trouble of like, are you a hack? Like, you don't want the judge to decide if you're the ethical hacker or not at the time you got caught, right? What you really want to do is go read the bug bounty disclosure pages of these companies where they've said, hey, here's exactly what we want you to do. And so in the case that anything happens and you are following those guidelines, you are actually doing things exactly as the company or the owner of whatever asset you're, quote unquote, attacking is asking you to do. And that will provide you with a lot of coverage that you would not want to be put at risk of you, being seen as a criminal. So that's my one caveat as you think about going into space to be sure of. But yeah, I would say it's not too difficult to learn. It just takes a lot of time, and I think you realize quickly if you like it or not. And it is highly beneficial, though. It's a great way to there's a full career in it, by the way. It's also called penetration testing, or pen testing is another like word for the actual job that someone's full-time job is to do this. So by the way, at Google, we also have people who we hire full-time just to do this, or do breakdowns of the security technology. So there's a ton of variants out of it, but it's actually a great way to get started. Just please read the bug bounty pages, read like the responsible disclosure rules set out by the company, so you can make sure that you don't get in any legal trouble from doing it. That's the one caveat I'll give.
Cool. Thank you. Des O'Reilly, you're on if you have a question or comment for us.
Yeah, hi. So just to reiterate the importance of security, going back to what you said earlier about how it's important to call like the actual like well-known bank number and stuff like that. I personally know many people, a couple of my friends who've lost all their money to hackers in their bank account. So I feel like the importance of knowing like who you are actually talking to and stuff like that. And I kind of gained a new appreciation for the two-factor authentication, because I always thought that it was like just a pain in the butt, always having to pull out my phone and like answer all these questions. But just like the risk and rewards of like using the two-factor authentication are just huge, and like protecting all like your personal information and your accounts.
Hey, there we go.
Yeah, this is a great point. Sorry that happened to your friends. That's a tough situation, but it definitely happens. And you're right. Like, I mean, 2FA is a pain in the butt. Like, I don't think it's true. It is, but there's a reward to it. The other thing to think about for those who have, bank accounts or even into crypto is, segmenting your accounts such that like large pools of money are in multiple different accounts. So even if one account is hacked, you can isolate the damage from that. And we'll see that pretty commonly in enterprise systems, or even personally, that's what I'll do. And I'll have, say my credit card tied to a well-known bank account that's, used for a lot of transactions, have a small pool of money in it, and then have larger pools of money that are like more important, like retirement savings account, separated and just not touched by anything but like maybe my employer, right? So it's a good thing to think about also, in addition to basic security methods, if you want to be even more secure, to start to segment out your pools of money in different places, such that if there's a hack or, by the way, institutional risk, that's all covered in kind of, the risk is mitigated by having different pots in different places.
Thank you.